What is Calvinism? Calvinism is a system of theology that is associated with theologian John Calvin, who lived from 1509 to 1564. Calvin wrote prolifically about his theological view in his most famous work called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, commonly referred to as simply the Institutes. The entire system is commonly summarized with the TULIP acronym, which was first coined in 1932 by Loraine Boettner in his book titled The Reformed Doctrine of Predestination. His book states, "The 5 points may be more easily remembered if they are associated with the word TULIP, T-U-L-I-P. T, total inability, U, unconditional election, L, limited atonement, I, irresistible efficacious grace, and P, perseverance of the saints." The acronym labels are not always the same. Sometimes total inability is listed as total depravity. Limited atonement is often conveyed as particular atonement or definite atonement. These are just 5 summary points and should not be thought of as representing the entirety of the Calvinistic theological system. These 5 points go back to a legal theological controversy that was addressed during the Synod of Dort, which convened from 1618 to 1619. This synod considered Jacob Arminius' 5 primary grievances with Calvinistic doctrine. Those grievances were called remonstrants, and they were overruled by a reaffirmation of doctrinal distinctives called the contra-remonstrants. By the time the synod convened, both Calvin and Arminius had died, and Theodore Beza, who was a very firm Calvinist, was the prominent elder of the time. These 5 contra-remonstrants quickly became the connotative summary of the entire Calvinistic system as they represented key distinctives. These are the same 5 points that Loraine Boettner summarized with his TULIP acronym. Calvinism didn't really start with John Calvin. Calvin quoted St. Augustine 1,708 times in his writings, which represents more than 50% of all his patristic period citations. He relied on Augustine exclusively for certain doctrines, including that of justification and predestination, according to S.J. Hahn in his article An Investigation into Calvin's Use of Augustine. John Calvin wrote, "Augustine is so wholly within me that if I wished to write a confession of my faith, I could do so with all fullness and satisfaction to myself out of his writings." St. Augustine was a Manichaean Gnostic prior to his conversion to the Catholic faith. His conversion was facilitated in part by the allegorical interpreter Ambrose. Manichaeism is a Persian form of Gnosticism which included concepts of a division between elect and hearers, a dualistic view of material things, absolute predestination of all things, and lack of human will or agency. Shortly after 411 AD, when Augustine was embroiled in the Pelagian controversy, he resorted back to the ideas found in his Manichaean Gnosticism in order to refute Pelagius in a rivalrous dynamic. While they have been slightly modified and adapted to the Christian narrative, all distinctives of Calvinistic doctrine can be traced back to their original form in Augustine's Manichaean Gnosticism. To this day, when most Christians, including non-Calvinists, hear the term predestination, their preconception of that word is Augustinian predestination, not the predestination that is found in Scripture. This presuppositional error sets the stage for many people to be unwittingly deceived into Calvinism. The T in TULIP stands for total depravity or total inability, and ultimately means that an individual is incapable of believing the gospel unless they are first regenerated by God. This necessitates that with regard to conversion, regeneration is sequenced before faith. This doctrine is also responsible for the Calvinistic premise that there is no free will, or as Dr. Ken Wilson points out, no free will. With total depravity, not only are people incapable of believing the gospel, but they would also never desire or will to do so. This doctrine is also the foundational axiomatic cornerstone of the structure of the Calvinistic system, though it is strategically and deceptively avoided as a starting point of the narrative, which is usually about God's control or sovereignty. The reason that this is the foundational axiomatic cornerstone for the Calvinistic system is twofold. First, it was the axiomatic starting point of St. Augustine after encountering Pelagius. Secondly, if this doctrine is true, then the U and the I and the P necessarily cascade from it like an unavoidable waterfall. This cascade is a logical requirement irrespective of any consideration of Scripture. Consequently, this cascade of doctrines has to be reverse engineered back into Scripture in order to maintain the facade of scriptural authority and sola scriptura. If people are incapable of believing the gospel, then what decides who gets regenerated? This is where the you in the tulip comes in, unconditional election. Unconditional election states that God selects individuals for salvation not based on any condition that they meet, such as works or faith. The decision is ultimately arbitrary, with nothing affecting who is chosen other than God's mysterious secret will and divine purposes for His ultimate glory. This point is placed at the top of the Calvinistic propagation narrative, wrapped in terminology of God's sovereignty, and it is usually manipulatively laced with strong suggestions that rejection of this doctrine is due to pride, self-exaltation, lack of humility, arrogance, hatred, dislike, unfairness, and desire to exalt oneself over God, among other things. If people are selected by God, what if they don't want to be saved? This is where irresistible grace comes to the answer, the I in tulip. With irresistible grace, the concept of grace is divorced from what is presented in Scripture and turned into a particular and specific force which is applied to individuals in the act of salvation, which overcomes any desire or ability to resist regeneration or obedience to the call of the gospel. Since people are totally depraved, their lack of desire and ability to believe must be irresistibly overcome. So if God selected people to save and then irresistibly regenerated them, what's stopping them from living exceedingly sinful lives? This is where the P enters the scene, perseverance of the saints. With perseverance of the saints, those who are truly elect will continue to persevere in faith and good works. Failure to persevere means that a person only received evanescent grace instead of efficacious grace. They either aren't elect after all, or they have yet to be genuinely regenerated. Perseverance of the saints is often confused or conflated with the idea of eternal security or once saved, always saved, commonly called OSAS. However, Calvinistic OSAS stems from the U, not the P. The P has to do with the behavior and faith of genuine Christians. This doctrine is leveraged for what is known as lordship salvation and also leads us to the no true Scotsman logical fallacy when assessing who is really saved. Limited atonement, or particular atonement, does not necessarily cascade from total depravity and was not foregrounded in Augustine's original doctrinal schema. However, it was discovered as another Calvinistic foundational cornerstone because, like total depravity, if it's true, then the rest of the tulip also necessarily cascades from it in a logical waterfall, again, irrespective of Scripture. The need to reverse engineer the tulip schema is exacerbated, not alleviated. Gottschalk of Orbase, 808-867, introduced the concept of limited atonement, saying, "Our God and Master Jesus Christ was crucified only for the elect." This position necessitates that the rest of the tulip cascade from it in a logical deduction of the consequences of this premise. Thus, many Calvinists, such as Matt Slick, advocate for the Calvinist position almost exclusively from the premise of the limited atonement doctrine. This doctrine was open to criticism that it viewed Christ's death and blood as weak and powerless with regard to not being the propitiation for the sins of the whole world. Thus, later proponents of this doctrine, such as Peter Lombard, presented a modified version of it stating that Christ's death was sufficient to save everyone, but only efficient to save the elect. Several well-known Christian leaders are Calvinistic, such as John MacArthur, John Piper, R.C. Sproul, Mark Driscoll, Tim Keller, Chuck Swindoll, Rick Warren, and many others, not to mention many well-known names from the past. While Calvinism could be regarded as more or less on par with other types of false doctrines such as Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholicism, or the Bethel movement, it is unique in its intentional and deceptive infiltration of non-Calvinist evangelical churches. Calvinists systematically target non-Calvinist churches with the intent to infiltrate and convert them into Calvinistic churches. However, this intent is not stated up front, and the infiltrators are usually patient, with conversion plans ranging anywhere from 5 to 14 years of tiptoeing through the tulips before making their decisive move, typically through a sermon series on Romans or Ephesians, where they leverage the wording of certain passages to plant and exploit presuppositional vulnerabilities in the minds of their audience that will be used to assimilate them into the Calvinistic way of thinking. This methodology has provoked the nickname stealth Calvinism by those who have been affected by it. To maintain their cover and avoid the elephant in the room that they are following the wrong JC, Calvinists use sly code words to disguise their system. You may hear phrases like doctrines of grace, sovereign grace, reformed theology, systematic theology, Reformation doctrine, God-honoring theology, etc. While these pastors and leaders seem friendly and like good, godly Christians, They premeditated to deceive an audience that originally convened on a different platform than the one they intend to peddle. This infiltration is rampant. Day after day, church members reach out to Beyond the Fundamentals with horror stories about how this infiltration is happening in their church and how it has gone on undetected right under their noses until it is too late to stop. This is the main reason why Beyond the Fundamentals has dedicated so much time and resources to producing over 150 videos and documentation that refute Calvinism and that equip Christians and churches to stand their ground against deceptive infiltration. Our most popular video is Predestination, It's Nothing Like You Were Told. This video breaks the frame of Calvinistic presuppositions and starts the journey toward having a Bible-based perspective on salvation matters. Our other videos address the origin of Calvinism, the concept of election, Calvinist tactics, and many other issues in scripture passages. Be sure to check out our Do This Now video to find out how to prevent Calvinism from taking over your church before it's too late. Beyond the Fundamentals does not promote or agree with Arminianism, Pelagianism, Universalism, Synergism, Monergism, or any other ideological label to which Calvinists attempt to map their theological opponents. We also do not hold free will as an axiomatic premise, nor do we worship ourselves or think that we save ourselves. Browse the Beyond the Fundamentals YouTube channel and see the playlist titled Calvinism Defeated for helpful titles on this topic. Thanks for watching. May the Lord bless you, and good day.